Good evening. I am Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen. And I'm so pleased to welcome you here this evening. Tonight's lecture is the first lecture of 2021 and is part of the Labour, Literature and Landmark lecture series. We're very pleased to present tonight's lecture in partnership with the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and I'd like to express our appreciation for their help and support. A brief overview of the General Society. We were founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of New York City. Today, our 236-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the city of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our General Society Library, our John M. Mossman Locke Museum, our Mechanics Institute, and of course, our lecture series, which is now nearly 200 years old. Now, tonight, I am so pleased to be able to welcome Gregory Dietrich back as part of our lecture series. I especially appreciate Gregory being here this evening, as he has very recently broke his wrist and indeed even has surgery scheduled tomorrow morning, but is so, yes, here we are, there we go, the proof. But he's so kind to be here this evening in spite of having to deal with all of this. So thank you, Gregory. Gregory Dietrich is a graduate of Columbia University's Historic Preservation and Real Estate Development programs. He has been working in the field of historic preservation for over 20 years. Since 2009, he has been the sole proprietor of Gregory Dietrich Preservation Consulting, where he has completed historic architectural investigations, National Register nominations, historic tax credit and grant applications, as well as preservation planning and policy studies and cultural resource studies. Yeah. In addition to his consulting work, he's worked as adjunct professor at FIT between 2008 2018, and he currently teaches a seminar within the Urban Design and Architecture Studies program at NYU. In addition to teaching, Mr. Dietrich is regularly engaged as a guest speaker, tour guide, moderator, and panelist on a wide variety of preservation topics. Before I greet Gregory, I just want to say there will be a short Q&A at the end of Gregory's talk, which will be about 10 or 15 minutes, and we will ask you to submit those questions in a timed format. Now, Gregory this evening will explore the vestige of Greenwich Village's equine past as he takes us down the bridle path of this all but forgotten yet tangible legacy of village horse culture. It is now a huge pleasure to introduce to you Gregory Dietrich.
Thank you very much, Karen. And thank you for joining me tonight as we take a look at a ubiquitous yet mostly forgotten influence on Greenwich Village's historic architecture. Before I begin, I would like to thank Victoria Dengel and Karen Taylor and the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen for sponsoring this program in partnership with the New York Landmarks Conservancy. And by the way, the sketch that you see here was done by my father, who loved the physicality of horses in motion and often made them the subject of his work as a fine artist. And that's one of his paintings behind me. So tonight we'll be looking at the history of horses in New York City, and specifically Greenwich Village, in three parts: the colonial and federal eras, the 19th and early 20th centuries, and how this history has been manifested in village architecture. I wasn't able to find any evidence to suggest that the Lenape Indians had horses on the island of Manhattan prior to Dutch and English settlement. During the 1620s, Dutch settlers imported strong and stocky horses into New Amsterdam to carry heavy loads and operate grist and sawmills. One account from 1660 reported that, quote, only 27 out of 50 horses shipped from Curaçao in the flyboat Equine have arrived at New Amsterdam, the rest having died from want of good fodder, and that most of which survive are so weak they can neither walk nor stand, that have to be carried in carts and on sledges from the scow and the shore to the pasture. And yet, even despite the challenges of importing these horses, the Dutch preferred them to oxen, since they were capable of clearing fields at a faster rate. And I just wanted to point out that the drawing that you see on the top there is allegedly the earliest representation of a horse on the island of Manhattan, circled in red, which is basically a horse in a cart there. And then, of course, below we just have a harbor scene also from the period. Very likely ships of this size, would have carried these horses across the Atlantic. By the 1660s, English colonists had begun importing finer-boned horses and established a racetrack in Hempstead, Long Island, to cultivate faster breeds. In fact, it was reported that Governor Nichols had begun organizing a horse race in 1668, not so much for recreational purposes, but to improve the speed of the breed. Also during this time, trotting became popular along the wide and straight roads of Manhattan. The following year, this became an annual event under Governor Lovelace, with prizes in wheat for the winner. Around 1725, the Church Farm Course opened, most likely in Lower Manhattan, as the first racetrack in New York City, and thoroughbred horse racing continued up until the American Revolution. This portrait that you see of George Washington was commissioned by the city of New York and originally displayed in Federal Hall on Wall Street. It now hangs in City Hall. It depicts him and his horse, Blueskin, just after the American Revolution, with Broadway in ruins and the last British boats and ships evacuating in the background. Blueskin was a half Arabian stallion with a dark iron gray coat that almost appeared blue. Because of his beauty, he was the horse that was featured in most of the paintings depicting Washington as a military hero. His other horse, Nelson, was apparently not as photogenic, but a far better war horse. Other signal events related to horses included the introduction of the first stagecoach line running between New York City and Boston in 1784, followed by the first stagecoach line running between Albany and New York City the following year. 4 years later, the first hackney coach was introduced by James Hearn, located at Cornelius Bradford's Coffee House at Old Slip. It also bears noting that by the end of the 18th century, the Common Council had prohibited horse racing on public highways and roads in response to a petition from the inhabitants of Bowery Lane. So I guess we could look at that as sort of the first neighborhood block association asserting its rights against traffic on its streets. Horses continued to play an important role in farming in New York City as property of farmers or large estate owners. This watercolor shows an estate owned by a merchant named John R. Livingston, which was located at the intersection of Grand and Division Streets on the Lower East Side. Notably, it was this painting that inspired I.N. Phelps Stokes to chronicle the history of Manhattan between 1609 and 1909 in his 6-volume study entitled The Iconography of Manhattan. So I just think it's rather significant, actually, beyond the fact that I was, of course, looking for any sort of early representations of horses. In this case, we have them out to pasture here, and then there's also a horse-drawn carriage here. But just sort of the bucolic setting of this, inspiring really one of the most major chroniclers of early Manhattan. That brings us to the 19th and early 20th centuries and the unprecedented rise of the horse in New York City. By 1855, the New York State Census indicated that there were 579,715 horses in the state, which averaged out to 1 horse for every 6 people. In New York City alone, by 1896, there were 4,649 stables, housing a record number of 73,746 horses. Thus, we can see the rise of the horse during this time in the following areas: leisure and recreation, transportation, public health and safety, and commerce and industry. And I should note that Harper's Weekly became a major source for me for this presentation, just because the illustrations from this magazine are just so evocative of life during the 19th century. And I particularly love this particular illustration entitled "Summer on Broadway," showing just utter pandemonium. And of course, we all have our own ideas about what summer in New York is like, in New York City is like. But this one really brings it home, just in terms of pedestrians, carriages, delivery carts, all basically coming to the fore at once on a very hot day. New Yorkers had a long infatuation with horses and recreation, even if such activities were not embraced by the local government. Some of these horse-related sports included polo matches, thoroughbred and harness racing, or spontaneous carriage races that would erupt among amateurs along any one of the main thoroughfares. Jerome Park in the Bronx was the center of both polo matches and horse races during the early 19th century, while also affording spectators the opportunity to let loose on the open road of the Harlem Speedway in getting there. In fact, amateur horse racing was banned between 1802 and 1821 as, quote, aristocratic and immoral. However, after the ban was repealed, harness racing grew in popularity, surpassing thoroughbred racing, with New York City becoming the center of harness racing. Prior to its annexation to the city of New York, Queens was the most active borough of any, boasting the opening of 4 racetracks during the 19th century, followed by 3 in Brooklyn and 2 in the Bronx. These 3 illustrations are all of Jerome Park in its heyday. I like to think of this as maybe one of the first tailgating parties in the city. And then what we have down here is the first Madison Square Garden, and you've got one of those races happening there. The building, of course, was located in Madison Square, designed by Sanford White. The Harlem Speedway is depicted here, following along the Harlem River, looking north toward the High Bridge. Horses played a pivotal role during the 19th century in the areas of private and public transportation. During this time, most people relied on livery drivers for travel within New York City and stagecoaches for travel beyond, until the advent of the steam-powered locomotive. Streets during this time were filled with horseback riders, private carriages, stagecoaches, omnibuses, delivery wagons, and horse-drawn rail cars. In 1831, John Stephenson introduced the omnibus, a horse-drawn vehicle used for public transport. And here's an example of an omnibus. And in 1832, the New York and Harlem Railroad introduced the first horse-drawn rail car in the world along the Bowery. And here's an example of a horse-drawn rail car below. The purpose of the line was to act as a shuttle for passengers traveling between 42nd Street and Lower Manhattan, where steam locomotives had been banned. The length of the railway was 7.5 miles, using 162 cars and 1,159 horses. By 1858, the 5 principal horse-drawn street railways, were carrying almost 35 million passengers a year. So one can only imagine really the labor that was involved with respect to the urban horse in ferrying these people back and forth between Lower Manhattan and Midtown. And of course, it bears noting that at 42nd Street, starting in the 1870s, we had the Grand Central Depot, which would then, of course, take you northward by steam locomotive. Probably already know all of this horseback rider, of course. Here's a hackney driver. We've got the stagecoach here, the omnibus, as I just described, a delivery wagon, and then the horse-drawn streetcar. And what I particularly love about this image, which is of the New York Times building in Times Square, is all of these come together. And so you really get a sense of a very active street before the vehicular days. And of course, pedestrians crossing at their peril. Just going to go back one. Wait, let's see. So horses also played a pivotal role in the areas of health and safety, especially during the Progressive era, pulling ambulances and wagons containing disinfectant or garbage and aiding firefighters and policemen in the line of duty. As early as 1840, horses began to be used to pull fire trucks for firefighting. In particular, fire horses had to be trained to run to a spot under their harness when the bell rang in the firehouse. Then wait patiently for the harness to be dropped from the ceiling and hitched, speed to fires at high speeds, and then stand quietly and unattended by a curb while a fire raged nearby with crowds of onlookers gathering round. It's been said that fire horses were so well trained that when they aged and were sold for new tasks, their owners sometimes could not stop them from running back to their old firehouse at the sound of the fire bell. In 1904, the New York City Police Department had 800 horses, which were primarily used by mounted police to control traffic jams. As a result of a training process that could take 6 months, these horses could switch leads, angle off ramps, and slow down and push crowds sideways. One famous horse was even trained to hold a suspect's wrists in his mouth firmly enough to keep him from running without breaking his skin. So truly remarkable in terms of how these horses were trained and the work that they were doing for public safety. The life of the urban horse was unrelenting in terms of the tasks it was expected to perform. According to The Horse in the City by Clay McShane, quote, the urban horse commonly had a career that began with a training period doing light farm work when the horse was broken to harness. Then he hauled for a street railway firm, which sold him to a delivery firm, which sold him to a cab firm, which sold him to a peddler. Peddlers and cabbies generally had the oldest, least sound horses. Some horses that became chronically lame on pavement were sold to farms, as were other horses that were poor feeders that might fare better in a grazing environment. Lameness and then the veterinarian's pistol was the most common end for city horses. A horse-based economy demanded enormous inputs of labor, land, and capital, including work tools for horses, stables, and roads, massive amounts of land for grazing and cultivating feed, employees, grooms, horseshoers, and veterinarians. Very large stables also employed carriage painters, horseshoers, wheelwrights, purchasing officers, accountants, managers, etc. In addition, the manufacture of horse clothing included saddles, blankets, harnesses, and whips. Other occupations included saddle makers, carriage trimmers, feed and grain suppliers, draymen, also known as beer deliverers, liverymen, teamsters, which were originally the drivers of multiple horses, and hostlers, which were horse sitters for people staying at an inn. By the 1830s, New York City had become the leading manufacturer of horse-drawn vehicles in the US. In addition, other products included tools for cleaning stables and accessories for grooming horses. By 1850, New York City boasted the heaviest concentration of horse-drawn vehicles and component manufacturers in the United States. Even manure was commodified, enabling stable keepers to sell manure for fertilizer to farmers, with manure from stables commanding the highest price and manure from the streets commanding the lowest due to its impurity. The Bull's Head Stable, of which we have an illustration here, a quite colorful illustration, was located at East 23rd Street between Lex and 2nd Avenues. Contained 1,000 stalls, while Fist, Doer, and Carroll's stable building and auction mart, occupying a block between East 24th and 25th Streets, was essentially a 7-story horse hotel, featuring a 67-foot wide by 200-foot long arena ringed by a stadium that seated 1,000 spectators and was lit up by electricity, windows, and skylights. The Titchener Grand Stable, located on Central Park West, between West 61st and 62nd Streets, was considered the last of the great horse palaces, featuring a 6-story stable crowned by a skylit show ring where horses were exercised and auctioned. And just as a side note, I don't know if any of you have visited the Winter Garden Theater on around 50th Street and Broadway, but that was a former horse palace, which still bears remnants in its infrastructure of its days as a horse palace. So just rather interesting that even places that we visit today have these, for lack of a better word, palimpsests of the horse culture in New York City. There were also private stables housing an estimated 300 saddle horses during this time. In addition, large peddler stables housing horses and delivery equipment, such as harnesses and wagons, were located throughout the city. So I did want to just touch on really the abuse and the remedy for abuse of horses. In 1865, Henry Bergh founded the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, believing that death by the slaughterhouse was preferable to death by the whip. When horses became sick, lame, or just too old to justify the money spent in feeding and stabling them, their owners had them shot. But ironically, it was the ASPCA that was the leading killer of horses, having shot between 1,800 and 7,000 a year in New York City between 1887 and 1897. And this was due to insurance requirements that prevented an owner from shooting a horse, and the ASPCA's credibility in making diagnoses and taking action. In 1900 alone, over 20,595 dead horses were removed from New York City streets. So another thing that we don't think of, because often, most of the time when you're seeing these beautiful evocative illustrations, such as those we're seeing in Harper's, you don't see, images of dead horses or even the manure lining the streets. But of course, this was a very real problem in New York City. Through support by the city, the ASPCA played a leading role in monitoring and penalizing animal abusers. In fact, it categorized and inventoried the abuses of horses, which were chronicled in its annual report of 1884, citing harness sores, beating, lameness, abandonment or starvation, overloading, which is what we're seeing in this illustration, working sick horses, reckless driving, maliciously killing or wounding them, selling diseased horses, exposing them to storms, and just driving them until they died. The abuse of horses used for commercial purposes was often an outgrowth of company owners who demanded that their drivers prioritize speed over everything else, making the driver's livelihood dependent on making his horses move faster at any cost. Conversely, companies that relied on horses to make regular deliveries of their products did have a special incentive to provide them with good housing and to maintain them in good condition. In these instances, horses were a symbol of company pride, important to their sales success, and a major capital investment. So really we can see these two sides of the coin with respect to the commercial use of horses. And now to just touch on the decline of the horse in the city before I talk about horse-related architecture in the village. Horses in urban centers posed a variety of problems. They needed housing and stables and space to store grain and hay for feed. There was the aspect of pollution. The average horse produces 2 to 3 gallons of urine and 30 to 50 pounds of manure per day. Horse fatalities on the streets of New York City averaged 15,000 per year. And on average, a horse only lived 2 to 4 years at this time, which also speaks to the heavy demands put on the horse. And of course, they then had to be transported to offal docks and shipped to rendering plants. Other factors included nearby inhabitants who associated horses and stables with disease, as exemplified by the citywide distemper epidemic of 1870, and fires that were certainly common with respect to stables and the preponderance of hay in stables. In addition, health boards imposed strict requirements on the handling and storage of manure, resulting in costs outweighing the benefits of manure sales to farmers. So although that had sort of a time where people were riding that wave of commodifying manure, as the health department became more and more scrutinizing, the regulatory aspect of that really diminished the profit motive there. By 1912, the automobile and other forms of mass transit had eclipsed the horse as the most popular means of travel, leading to the latter's inevitable decline. As Clay McShane noted, quote, "What was new was not horses themselves, but traffic, especially mixed traffic. Between 1909 and 1913, horse-drawn vehicles still constituted the majority of the growing volume of travel, while the dismal traffic jam had already become a conspicuous feature of modern city life." So what we're first seeing is the end of the era of the horse, and with that, the concentration of the horse, creating traffic jams. And then, of course, as we transition now into automobiles and buses and such, we're now seeing first this mix of horse and automobile traffic, vehicular traffic, and then finally the phasing out of the horse so that it just becomes what we see today. Of course, we see this manifested in so many different forms of transportation now. Even after the automobile had replaced the private carriage in the city and become the new status symbol, there was a countervailing increase in pleasure riding and horse shows during the early to mid 20th century, reflecting the decline of the horse as machine and its rise as a model specimen of beauty and athleticism. So just a couple of things here. Certainly the ad, which is self-explanatory, encouraging consumers to dispense with the horse and get on board with the automobile. And then also just a street scene showing the enormous amount of manure. And I'm not sure, but this very well may be a dead horse on the side of the road as well. It's not quite clear. And then just sort of a very evocative illustration, just showing mixed feelings about horses. You've got this waif that's taunting these horses, which is then, of course, in turn scaring this elderly lady. So that brings us to the village. Despite its, within Greenwich Village, we can see how the rise of the horse culture permeated these 4 areas of village life. For example, as early as 1753, 1 year after the death of Admiral Sir Peter Warren, his heirs began sponsoring races on his former estate, which consisted of a 300-acre tract of land overlooking the Hudson that included a mansion known as Warren House as its centerpiece. Warren himself was a British naval officer from Ireland and a large landowner whose holdings included property outside of New York City as well. So the title of this one on the right is The Residence of Abraham Van Ness, but this is the former Admiral Peter Warren house. And then, of course, this is a map of his property, just to give you an idea of his extensive holdings. Pretty much what we know as the West Village today certainly would be appraised as probably in the billions today. Despite its unorthodox street pattern, Greenwich Village had multiple connections to the horse-drawn public transportation systems that served Manhattan's grid starting in the early 19th century. These transportation systems included the Greenwich Hotel stage, which ran between the Greenwich Hotel in the area of Christopher and Weehawken Streets and City Hall. And I should note that the Greenwich Hotel was not there just by chance. The former, well, not former, but there was a prison, the Newgate Prison, which was the first New York State prison that was constructed in this area. So this was something that became a major tourist attraction. So in addition to the fact that this line would have connected prisoners, prospective prisoners from the courthouse area, and then led them over to the prison, this was also a wonderful route that could get, tourists also to the Greenwich Hotel to look at the prison from the outside. The Broadway stage, introduced in 1830, featured elegant stagecoaches that were led by a team of 4 horses that ran between Bowling Green to the south and Bleecker Street to the north. The Bleecker Street line was a horse-drawn streetcar that was introduced in 1864 between the West 14th Street Ferry in Chelsea and the Fulton Street Ferry in the financial district, running along Bleecker, Crosby, and Lafayette Streets on the way. And I have to say, I look at this route and I think, I would take this today. I mean, it's very interesting south and crosstown excursion here. The Fifth Avenue stage really was the link to Upper Manhattan, introduced in 1896, operating between Bleecker Street and Yorkville, East 89th Street on the Upper East Side. So I only have a few examples related to public safety in the village. The former Washington Military Parade Ground on the site of today's Washington Square Park, and the former 9th Police Precinct located at 133-137 Charles Street. In 1826, the former Potter's Field in today's Washington Square was acquired by the city and converted into the Washington Military Parade Ground. Military parade grounds were public spaces where volunteer militia companies could train. In this illustration, we see the 7th Regiment, also known as the Silk Stocking Regiment of Park Avenue Armory fame, and its cavalry, completing its military exercises. Between 1848 and 1850, the parade ground was converted into parkland and fell under the jurisdiction of the newly created New York City Parks Department, which was organized in 1871. The former 9th Police Precinct was designed by Jean Dufay in the Romanesque Revival style between 1896 and 1897, and dedicated by Theodore Roosevelt, who was president of the New York City Board of Police Commissioners. It included a station house, cell block, and stables, the latter of which were accessed via a pair of metal doors on the far right side of the building. And in 1976, this building was converted into Le Gendarme Apartments. Le Gendarme, of course, is French for policeman. Even today, with its unwieldy development and outrageous architecture, Gansevoort Market has an uncanny sense of place that harkens back to its late 19th century identity as an outdoor marketplace, which served farmers from outside of the city who would come into the city to sell their produce, predating its transformation into a meatpacking district during the early 20th century. Horses were not only integral to the success of this farmers market, but also integral to the success of the meatpacking industry in the district and early trucking concerns in the area. Further south, the reestablishment of the Hoboken Ferry at the foot of Christopher Street in 1841 prompted commercial interest to cluster near the waterfront. By the 1850s, blacksmiths and grain and feed warehouses were among the businesses within this commercial district. Moreover, residents of Christopher Street included numerous blacksmiths, stage drivers, harness providers, saddlers, wheelwrights, coachmakers, and stagehands, perhaps owing to the burgeoning retail trade starting to occur around Union Square during this time. Michael J. Hallahan, whose factory was located on Barrow and West 4th Streets, was the first to patent the rubber horseshoe pad, or should I say vulcanized rubber horseshoe pad, as seen as in this advertisement, which provided traction on icy roads for the horse. In addition to all the goods manufactured to support the horse economy, there was also a large clothing industry to outfit coachmen and grooms, which included dress livery and undress livery, depending on the activity. And dress livery basically was the formal attire of the livery driver versus the casual attire, the undress livery of the livery driver. This view of Broadway between 8th and 9th Streets features a tailor dedicated to the livery clothing trade. So that piqued my interest and thought I would just include this image. Historically, wealthy New Yorkers built their stables behind their homes. However, after the Civil War, they situated them further away to avoid the noise and smell, often locating them on side streets where land costs were cheaper. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, streets reserved for private and livery stables had become common. Most of the stables that were built on MacDougal Alley were erected by the homeowners of Washington Square North and 8th Street around 1833. However, by the turn of the 20th century, the stables had fallen into disrepair until they were revitalized by neighborhood artists who converted them into studios and/or studio residences, and the row became known as Art Alley Deluxe. Among the painters and sculptors who converted these buildings was Frederick Treble, Guy Pendubois, Ernest Lawson, Henry Bush Brown, Joe Davison, James Fraser, Daniel Chester French, Philip Martini, and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. In addition to MacDougal Alley, 8th Street also offered livery stables to board one's horse and carriage, which was also an option for the residents of Washington Square if they didn't own their own stable. I think what's, well, first of all, note the Deming children having tea in this photo. It's such a quirky caption about a quirky activity in MacDougal Alley. But here we do really get a sense of the more utilitarian nature. If any of you have been to these MEWS, you can recognize that they have been renovated. Some of these are very early renovations in rather exotic styles. But in fact, most of them did have a rather utilitarian character to them originally. One MacDougal Alley, shown here, was built as a 3-story stable between 1854 and 1879, with an entrance to the upstairs apartments on the alley side, so that would be here, and a carriage entrance on the street side, which unfortunately is not shown, but would be on this side, which is MacDougal Street. So here's the intersection right here. I thought this is rather interesting. This is a renovation that was completed by Raymond Hood, one of the famed architects of Rockefeller Center. You see the real sort of streamlined modern motifs going on here. And then here, again, is just one of these remodels that shows this rather picturesque Tudor Revival style as applied to a former stable. Serving the townhouses on Washington Square North, the initial development in Washington MEWS was along the north side of the private street behind 8th Street lots and furthest away from the houses on Washington Square. Leases stipulated that only private stables were permitted, excluding any other commercial or noxious uses. Most of the stables on the north side were built in 1833 and remodeled by Maynick and Frank in a Mediterranean revival style in 1916. So these are very early remodeling in this rather exotic style And here again, you can see the difference between this original, rather utilitarian character of these stable buildings and then the redo for the artist's studio residences. And I think we do have the landmarks law to thank, as well as the early designation of Greenwich Village to thank, with respect to how largely intact Washington MEWS is to this day when you visit it. And happy to say also that this is publicly accessible. The gates are usually open. You can walk right in. But here you can do a little compare and contrast in terms of the views. Number 15, which is this building here on the south side, closer to University Place, is a rare survivor from the period when these buildings operated as stables. This was built as a row of 6 in the early 1850s, and as you can see, still retains its brick detailing and arched entrances. The western half of the south side of Washington MEWS consists of a row of 10 two-story houses with studios that was constructed in 1830. So I find this rather interesting that Mainick and Frank in 1916 are doing a redo of these utilitarian stables in a Mediterranean revival style. And that becomes so fashionable that then in 1930, you have new construction of these former stables, but to look like studio residences in this Mediterranean revival style. So that brings us to private stables. By private, of course, I mean stables owned by individuals to provide shelter for their horse. These typically featured a carriage or wagon stall in front of the building, as you can see here, with the horse stalls in the back of the building, which may have faced a rear yard or in an alleyway. And then you would have the apartment for the livery driver on the second floor in the front of the building, with the hayloft on the second floor in the back of the building. And of course, this was deliberate to separate the human from the horse as far as possible for day-to-day living. And of course, due to the smells associated with the horse. In 1866, the village had 196 private stables. 22 Jane Street was built in 1868 for Calvin Demarest by a carpenter named Charles H. Demarest, who was most likely related to him. And it followed the typical layout of a small stable, as I just described. 23 Cornelia Street was designed by Charles B. Myers for Joseph Marins around 1912. In 1925, it was converted into a laundry. And in 1967, it was converted into an artist studio / garage with an apartment on the second floor. And of course, these buildings over time have become very fashionable to live in. The conservative synagogue of Fifth Avenue, located at 11 East 11th Street, is one of the more picturesque stables within Greenwich Village, occupying an unusual setback that is also visible from the street. It's visible, but blink and you'll miss it. It's between these two larger buildings. So you just sort of peer in, and you can actually walk back there and take a look at it, but you can see it from the sidewalk. This was built as a stable before 1898 and later converted into a garage with a loft. During the early 20th century, it was remodeled in an arts and crafts style with stucco parging and diamond-shaped tile patterns set within the parapet. As for 40 West 10th Street, it's unclear as to when what the original design looked like. It was originally built as a stable that was converted into a studio in 1912 by Henry E. Scholl, who reimagined it as a neo-Renaissance style townhouse for the sculptor Charles Keck. And the last one, 185 West 4th Street, was built between 1897 and 1899 at the rear of a federal house located at 128 Washington Place. It was remodeled in 1919 from a garage into a studio, and again in 1937 from a studio into a house. It is a neo-federal style house with a design by Fred H. Fairweather. So here you can see three very distinct styles that really are later reinventions of these stable buildings. Now we can turn our attention to some commercial stables. 15 Downing Street was constructed between 1829 and 1832 as a stable before being converted into a brewery between the late 1850s and the early 1890s. In 1892, it was reconverted into a stable that accommodated wagons on the first floor and 16 horse stalls on the second floor. The third floor may have been a hayloft. Now I have to say, looking at this building, which reads really with the dimensions or proportions of a typical row house, very hard to imagine 16 horse stalls on the second floor of this building. But that is according to the designation report. 129 Charles Street was commissioned by Herman Thalmann and designed by Henry Anderson in 1897. It was built as a livery stable, and Thalmann subsequently occupied the second floor with his family while renting out the stable portion to a few livery tenants between 1897 and 1900. Upon his death in 1900, it was sold and again leased to various livery companies before being converted into a garage for trucking. Oops. The New York Biscuit Stables, located at 439-445 West 14th Street, was commissioned by a descendant of John Jacob Astor, who originally owned the land, and designed by Thomas R. Jackson. It was built to house the horses, which served the New York Biscuit Company, which merged with the American Biscuit Company to become the National Biscuit Company, the inventor of the Oreo cookie. Its later iterations included a garage, warehouse, house, and now it houses a soundstage. 49 Downing Street was designed in the Romanesque Revival style by Werner and Windolf in 1896 as a stable and a single-family dwelling for John F. Carragher, a truckman. 10 years later, it was leased to Borden's Condensed Milk Company and later converted into a garage. Between 1924 and 1934, the Trinity Dairy Company used it as a garage, dairy, office, stable, and wagon storage. In the mid-1980s, it was converted into a multifamily dwelling. Now, I find this particularly interesting that between 1924 and 1934, really a few, well, at least a decade after the horse had gone out of fashion in New York City, this dairy company was still using the horse-drawn wagon to deliver its milk. So it just does sort of speak to really this sort of romanticized notion of the horse and having your milk delivery by a horse-drawn wagon during this time. Just so interesting. Proprietor Conrad Schaefer built this commercial stable at 15 Barrow Street, which was designed by H. Hassenstein in 1896, who crowned it with a magnificent horse head. It was converted into an apartment house between 1927 and 1928. And this building has really held up well, again, thanks to its designation. So now I just wanted to touch on some vestiges of horse-related architectural features in the village. First, we have an example of the horse walk, which is what you see here. So this modest doorway under this modest window, this would have been, well, and still is, a tunnel running through the row house to the rear yard stable. Above it, you would have had probably a storage area. Here, just an example of the boot scraper. So, I urge you when you're walking down the streets of the village to see if you can spot the boot scrapers because they are historic. And Certainly, sometimes these are standalone at the top of the stairs. I think some in Washington Square have them that are standalones. But when you see this elaborate ironwork, sometimes you can see the boot scrapers there too. Here we've got an example of a carriageway running through a house in the Charles King Van Dam Historic District. And this is really rather unusual. The horse walks you see a little bit more of in the village and down in this district as well. But to have a carriageway that's integrated into the house is really rather unique and pretty special with respect to paying homage to the horse. So this carriageway led to a 3-story stable that is no longer there, but there is a garage there. So it does serve the function for cars to park at the garage in the rear yard. And then finally, the horsehead keystone, probably one of the most evocative reminder of the days when horses played such a central role in village life. Although you can find vestiges in other forms, such as the horseshoe plaque that adorns Michael Hallahan's original rubber shoe horse pad factory at 9 Barrow Street. And here we can see his ad and hear how he's used it as his logo that is now memorialized in this plaque on his building. And then finally, although it may have taken its name from the popular Grosvenor Hotel nearby on Fifth Avenue, Grosvenor Stables operated as a livery stable. It was built between 1863 and 1879 and features original stable doors along with original signage. It's also notable as the home of playwright Edward Albee for many years. So that brings us to today. The last vestiges of the horse in New York City can be seen in the mounted horse police and the carriage horses that can be found in and around Central Park or along the parade route. So I thank you.
Gregory, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to clap, and I'm sure there are many people out there clapping. Thank you so much. That was really just such a fascinating overview, and you encompass so much in your talk. I am going to now open the Q&A, and the first question, in fact, comes from the General Society's Executive Director, Victoria Dengel, many of you will know, especially Gregory. So Gregory wondered, what inspired you to Victoria wondered what inspired you to delve into the subject of horses and the West Village.
So a couple of years ago, I was approached by the Salmagundi Art Club to devise a presentation on some aspect of village architecture. And this was in celebration of the Society for Greenwich Village for Historic Preservation's 50th year anniversary. So it just occurred to me that I didn't know much about this topic and decided to sort of delve into this, and it would be sort of a fun topic to research and present on. So I do not claim to be an expert on this topic, but I do have to say that after delving into the research, it was all-consuming. And the information that I was presenting in general about the horse in the city largely came from the book, The Horse in the City by Clay McShane, which for anyone who's interested in this subject matter, I highly recommend. He studied both New York City and Boston, looking at, just really all aspects of horse life during this period, really reaching this apotheosis in the late 19th century.
Right, and I also want to add that Victoria said your presentation was fantastic.
Oh,
thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Victoria.
And I think Victoria may be with us shortly. What is left? This is from Jeffrey Baldwin, and he wonders what is left now in junior and of the infrastructure for feeding and manure disposal. What did you find out in your vast research?
Oh gosh, I do not recall coming across anything about that that particular aspect. I do understand that those plants were often located at the docks, but I would imagine that you know, if anything survives, it's probably just the infrastructure of the docks themselves, but not any of those particular structures.
Right. Victoria, did you want to say something?
Yes, well, Gregory, I first of all, thank you. I'm speaking to you from our beloved board member's apartment, Penny Spector. And for our audience, you may have heard me make mention of her. And Penny passed away in December and was to turn 101 this year. So I'm working in her apartment right now to help take some of her deaccession objects to the General Society, where they will live forever. So that is why I'm not at the Society this evening. And Gregory, I was listening to the entire lecture as I worked, but I just wanted to say, as usual, and we'll get to the other questions, but I just want to acknowledge, Gregory, what a wonderful friend you are to the General Society. You know, our relationship with you started 6 years ago when you did a brilliant grant writing for us for the New York State Department of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. And as we always say, as when we give away our lifetime library memberships, that we just all, we never let you go. So this is 6 years later and several lectures later, you're still with us. And we're so blessed. So I just wanted to say that to you. And yet the lecture was once again brilliant, and I learned so much. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You're very welcome, and thank you for those kind words. And
Yes.
and Victoria, I think it actually means even more coming from Penny's apartment, I have to say.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you. Gregory.
it's really, really sweet.
Yes, thank you.
No.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Victoria. This is a message from, sorry, not a message. This is a question from Karen Madden. She comments, as I grew up in Queens, she's curious to know what the 4 racetracks were in Queens and where were they located, if you know the answer to that question, Gregory.
Can I get back to her?
Yes. Okay.
Because,
and after all, it was about the West Village, so I think that's
yes, and I apologize just
of
because
course.
I have been focused on the West Village.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hardy Pippin commented that when you the New York Times building was across from City Hall in 1988. He just wanted you to pass that up.
Oh, in 1880. Thank you very much.
1988. I'm sorry. No, 1888. I'm so sorry. In 1888. So he just wanted.
I want to thank Hardy for actually pointing that out, because I was relying on the configuration, but yet the building on the left looked to me like Newspaper Row around City Hall. So I really should have double checked that before I made that statement. Thank you for the correction.
Well, thank you, Hardy. This is from Robert Vanny, and he's particularly interested in the fire horses in the late 19th century, up to approximately 1922, which then saw the advent of the motorized fire engine. Any outstanding historical stories about such horses, and any suggestions for research on the topic of New York fire horses, though perhaps the horse in the city might be a good source. Yes?
That would be the best place to start, and I would look at the bibliography as well for that book. I have a feeling that must have started as a PhD, dissertation. No, I don't have any offhand in terms of just any anecdotes about the fire horses.
Right. Well,
but I have to tell you, there are some incredible images of fire horses in action. A project that I worked on as a consultant was the fire headquarters on J Street in Brooklyn, which has now been rehabilitated. But there were just incredible vivid images of the fire horses pulling the wagons out of that building. And it's such a spectacular building to begin with, but then to have it come to life with what was actually going on when it was used in its heyday is just spectacular. And that can be found on the Brooklyn Public Library website.
Right. Thank you. That sounds a great source. Laura Monig wonders if you know anything in particular about 45 to 47 Downing Street. No.
No.
Okay. Well, that's fine. Perhaps.
As opposed to 49.
Right.
Or are we calling this all one building?
I'm not sure.
Because if it does encompass all three of those addresses, then it would have been in my discussion of 49 Downing Street.
Right.
But if it is a separate stable, then I don't know.
Right. Okay. This is from Christy Nederman. And first of all, she says, fantastic talk. And she wonders, where did the words MEWS come from? Did you come across that in your research?
Gosh. Now, and Hardy can correct me if I'm wrong. I want to say that the word MEWS came from an English comedy that had been mounted in the early 20th century in New York, celebrating like this sort of bucolic English village. I want to say that that's where I believe the reference had come from. Of course, everybody can check their phones right now and tell me, but that's what I recall, but I may be off on that.
Right. Well, but of course, here's the irony now that the MEWS are truly bucolic, aren't they? MEWS now are such desirable places to live, and are usually so very, very attractive.
Exactly.
Which are more modern photographs and, clearly illustrated.
Yes. No, I actually have to correct myself because I just remembered what I was misremembering. That's Palmander Walk. Palmander Walk, which is on the Upper West Side, which is a MEWS. Got its name Palmander Walk from a play of the same name. That's what I was thinking of.
Oh, okay.
So I was conflating, unfortunately.
Well,
I do not know where
right.
MEWS.
Well, yeah. We can all, as you suggest, we can all Google MEWS and find out what it was originally. Yeah. Now, Elizabeth Sieta, going back, what did you say the average life of a horse was in the 1880s? I know it was short.
Yes.
Shockingly short.
Yeah, according to the Horse in the City, it was 2 to 4 years. Which is just brief. We know horses live much longer, maybe 4 times as long, if not more. Yeah,
what a hard life those poor horses must have had.
Yes.
This is from Rena Corey. Do you know, did Sniffen Court have stables?
Yes, my understanding Sniffen Court was a collection of stables. Sniffen Court is a great example of stables that would have postdated the Civil War in terms of being located considerably away from the houses that they were serving, the inhabitants of the houses that would have owned those horses.
Right. The next question is from an anonymous attendee, but I have to admit it's a question I also wondered about. How did they get the horses up to the 2nd or 3rd floors? I was really surprised to find out there were stables to 3 stories.
Right, and again, this is what sort of just confuses me about this Downing Street property, because they had ramps, and there are many vehicular or garages, auto garages around town that were formerly stables, and they have the ramp infrastructure in there. So you can understand exactly how the horse would have moved through the building. But I honestly cannot really begin to understand how they got horses to what looks like a row house onto the 2nd floor.
I know it is very puzzling. Yes. But anyway, I'm well. Okay, so maybe it was all ramps. By the way, Laurie Monick adds, well, she adds first fabulous. It sounded like she was going to say something else, but maybe she'll come back to tell us more about Downing Street. And Gregory, are you okay for time? I will take
Sure.
I will take a few more questions. Is that okay with you?
Fine.
Okay. Rena Corey writes, I'm 82 and from Brooklyn. And this is more a comment. We had horse-drawn peddler carts in the late 40s, at least.
Wow.
As you also implied that, with the milkmen being around the 40s. And she also wondered, have you looked at horses in other boroughs? But again, this could be out your remit for the West Village talk, right? Or is it?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So only to the extent, really, that I talked about it. If there was something that I could really speak to in terms of the 4 themes that I was discussing, then I could bring the other boroughs in. But generally speaking, no, I was not really sort of focused on it. So that wasn't what I was looking for in the research.
Right, and thank you. Another thank you comment for the presentation. Well, I don't know that this is from Joan Foriavanti. I don't know, this won't be possible, Joan, but Gregory will definitely repeat it. Can the title and author of that book, Horse in the City, be printed on screen, please? So could you repeat the name of the author? We won't be, or unless you did have it. Did you have it on the slide?
No, I don't.
No.
I don't.
Do you remember the name of the author?
Yes, it's Clay, C-L-A-Y, McShane, M-C, capital M, lowercase c, capital S, H-A-N-E.
Great. Well, hopefully, Joan, you'll be able to track it down from that. This is from Jeremy Woodruff, and it's not a question, but he's commenting, well, there is a history of the relationship of street pavements and horses. Spacing and design of cobblestones were matched to the design of horseshoes, which had tabs to fit in the joints. Horse traction was a big problem. Well, that's very interesting. You probably knew that, Gregory.
I had not come across that. That is fascinating.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. Well, thank you, Jeremy. I'm laughing at this next question. Was the horse manure valued by the Parks Department, as it was my dad in Scotland when I was a child? This writes John A.D. Sandy Needham. You don't know much about.
I don't know.
No. Okay. Well, hopefully, John Needham, it did go to a good home. So let's hope that. Now, again, this is a question outside your remit, but Jeffrey Jacobson does wonder, was there a similar setup for stables in Brooklyn? Do you know?
Yes, absolutely. Because of course we know, what comes immediately to mind are Brooklyn Heights. And I think also Clinton Hill has examples of MEWS and stable clusters similar to Sniffen Court.
Yeah, well, I can absolutely vouch on that because I have where I live, which is on Clinton Avenue. There's a whole street called Waverly Place, which there are many stables. Yes, in that area. Yeah. So we'll just take. Okay, I'm just going to take a few more questions, because I see time is getting on. Now, do you? Lester Barnett wonders, and he's sorry if he missed this when you said it, but where are the police horses stable today? Do you know, Gregory?
Well, only the one that I had mentioned, which is this one is. One 133-137 Charles Street.
Right. Well, that's
the 9th Police Precinct.
Right. Well,
yeah.
Right. So there you go. Now, we have some information coming in on MEWS.
All right. Great.
Okay. Karen Madden writes, mews are a row or courtyard of stables or carriage houses. And Deborah Pressman writes even a longer explanation. The word mews may also refer to a lane and alley in which stables are situated. The term originally referred to the royal stables in London, so called because they were built where the king's hawks once mewed, or confined at moting, in brackets, mew time. Well, who knew that, right? That's pretty obscure. Thank you very much, Deborah.
Thank you for that.
Yes. Okay, I'm just going to take 2 more questions, and I do apologize to the people we did not get to. Let's see. Oh, Deborah Falk also comments on mews. Let's see. What about, do you have any historical information about the stables, again, outside your remit, Gregory, about around Central Park and the riding trails in Central Park?
Well, I mean, I know that the Titchener stable that I mentioned, which was located on Central Park West, between West 61st and 62nd Streets, did have this relationship to the park with respect to exercising these horses. And then of course the Claremont stables, which is further on the Upper West Side in the 80s, which I think has now been converted into a school, if I'm not mistaken, also served as like a riding academy.
Right. Well, funny you should mention the Claremont stable, because in fact, so one of our Sally Eckhoff comments and gives an explanation. The Claremont stable, which houses horses in the Upper West Side through the 1990s, used ramps to get both to the 2nd floor and into the basement. It was quite an experience to be standing at the foot of the upstairs ramp and hear horses coming down.
That's fantastic.
Yes. So anyways, so I want to thank everyone who's commented. They didn't really make more comments, but I will end with a pun from one of our audience. Abby Heller comments, what about a title? Greenwich Village in its heyday.
All right, that will be the alternate title.
Yes,
great.
Absolutely. Gregory, I want to thank you so much, because really what an informative overview, and it was also so interesting finding out about the horses and knowing that there were the equivalent of horse carriage bus lines, and at that time that was all those things. It was packed full of information and so eloquently presented. So again, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, for launching our 2020 lecture season in such magnificent style. We are very grateful to you. Victoria, do you want to say anything else?
We're never short on thank yous. So our signature. So thank you. You're wonderful. And we can't wait to hear from you again.
Well, it was my pleasure. And I really have enjoyed this association with both of you and appreciate the good work you do.
Oh, thank you, Gregory. And you. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much to our audience for attending this evening. I'm just going to mention very quickly a couple of lectures that are upcoming. Next week, a week today, Radiators and Pandemics, A Curious Marriage with Dan Holohan. The following week, If Frames Could Talk with Suzanne Smeaton. And Tuesday, March 23rd, Stanford White in Detail with his great-grandson, Samuel White. And on Tuesday, April 20th, Multi-Stories, 55 Antique Skyscrapers with Mark Hauser. So thank you all for attending tonight. Gregory, many thanks to you. And hope your surgery goes extremely well tomorrow. And again, thank you for on the night before your surgery, making time to speak as part of the General Society lectures. With that, I'm going to say good night. So thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.